A response to Lindybeige, the beige god. Why do women have breasts? This is not a video specifically aimed at why do women have breasts. This is a general evolution video. This explanation does not limit itself to why do women have breasts. It's the same reason as to why we have legs or arms or any particular characteristics. Something I hear about a lot when people talk about evolution, they talk about function. They act as though legs evolved because legs are good at running, which makes absolutely no sense. The animal at some point did not have any legs. How did the animal figure out that it needed to run and then get legs? It didn't will itself to have legs. These legs had to just appear, and literally, I literally mean this. They had to literally just appear out of nowhere, and that's the point here. A particular population will not simply have a new advantage. That advantage needs to come up through statistical means. So what I mean by this is that at any given time, a given population will have a certain set of genes. So I don't start at single-celled organisms. I don't start at the time of RNA. I don't start at the beginning of time. I could do that, but I'm not going to do that because we just don't know what they look like. I'm going to start at the time of sexual reproduction and DNA. And so what we know of sexual reproduction is that you receive about it's not exactly, but it's about 50% of your DNA from one of the sexual partners and from the other sexual partner. This means that you are half and half from your parents, about. What is the statistical likelihood that you will receive a particular characteristic? Now, it's not 50%. For those who think it is, it isn't. Now, it gets a lot more complicated. I'm not going to do a full explanation as to how the whole evolution process happens. Suffice to know that it's not 100%. And because it's not 100%, this means that there needs to be some kind of statistical variation within the population of certain characteristics for you to be able to receive a particular characteristics. And when those two parents mate and their genetic code combines, that characteristic needs to be available at that time, at the time of your creation. If the combination of those two sets of DNA do not have the required parameters for you to exhibit the phenotypic characteristic, then you will simply not exhibit it. So that's what I mean by the statistical likelihood that you will exhibit a particular characteristic. Let's assume you have 150 individuals. That means you have 150 different sets of DNA, which means that you could arrange every single one of those sets of DNA with any other, with half the population, since it's a pairing, assuming half and half is of the two separate genders. So half and half, 75 of one, 75 of one. So you can pair any one individual with another 75 individuals, which means there's a huge and every single sperm also has a specific statistical chance of having a particular set of parameters. And so, you see, it's a lot harder to determine what exactly one individual is going to have. You can't really know. It's incredibly hard. First, I was going to give you the chance of one particular mating to happen of one of the 75, but you have to think about it. Every ejaculation has billions of sperm. How do you know which sperm is going to reach you? Because that one particular organism does not create one load of sperm that has exactly the same DNA. Every single one of those sperms has a different set of DNA. And it's the reason why the vagina is acidic and kills off almost all of the semen, because if the semen is not good enough to get to the ovary, well, one assumes it was broken or it was damaged or, So there's all that selection, and that increases the statistical likelihood that you will get certain characteristics. Anyway, that's the whole part of the mating process. Again, I'm not going to do a full explanation of evolution. It's beautiful. I've heard there's videos online for tutorials. You can look at that. It's your problem. Point being is that there is a statistical likelihood that a particular characteristic is going to be exhibited in a given population. And this brings us as to why a given population will not all exhibit the same characteristics. And you will find in similar populations a similar set of characteristics. So for example, let's assume you go to a population, you find that it's 5% of them are criminal. And you go to another population and find 5% of those people are criminals. Then let's assume you were to kill off 5% of those criminals, okay? You know what would happen? You would still have 5% criminals. Because the genes that create those people still exist in the rest of the population. It just so happens to be that 5% of people in that given population will be what we consider to be criminals. Now, laws change and things change. And then if you breed for a very long time, then you can change those percentages. So if you were to kill off that 5% every single generation, then yes, over time, they would disappear. because every pairing of people who could create criminals will be killed off. But for as long as you haven't killed off every single pairing of individuals who can exhibit a very particular characteristic, it will still be there. It will still be there at some statistical likelihood. Now, from this point on, since you cannot decide that you will exhibit some particular phenotypic characteristics, something like breasts, you cannot decide this. So as I've stated before, since there is a statistical likelihood that someone will have breasts, and so you need your population to reach a point in which there is enough genetic variation within your population so that breasts can exist. Once breasts can exist, then they fall within the natural evolution pattern. So then I will go from the male perspective, since that is the second gender, and it's often assumed that breasts are there because males like them. So, before breasts have evolved, before breasts exist, before there's enough genetic variation for breasts to exist, you could have an even split of the males who really like breasts and the males who do not like breasts. You can't know. It's completely random. Now, statistically speaking, it is unlikely that the males would have preferred breasts before breasts have evolved, because they would have, at least statistically, been disadvantaged. One could assume that the males who would have preferred breasts would have been less likely to reproduce and therefore not have as many offsprings as the males who do prefer breasts and therefore would have died off at some point. But it is not impossible, assuming it does not affect birth rates and likelihood of mating, then at that point you could make the statement that yes, there could be 50% of the population who likes breasts and 50% of the population who does not like breasts. It could be another percentage, it doesn't really matter, it depends on statistics. Again, not going into that. Point is, they could exist, but if they exist, it has no effect on whether or not the women are going to have breasts. It has no effect whatsoever. Unless the genes that make males like breasts also are the genes that create breasts to begin with. If that so happens to be true, then yes, at that point it would have an effect. Then at that point you could say, if they're the same genes and they're related, then you could make the statement, well, if this group of male likes breasts, that means that there is a good statistical likelihood that women would have breasts. But that's assuming they're related. That's assuming they're either related or the same genes, or, and they're just expressed differently in the different sexes, which now, at this point, I don't know. That is further than my expertise. You would have to ask someone else. As far as I know, there are no studies that show that. I've never heard of this. I don't think anyone's ever done it, but it might be true. It might be true. Now, if you prove that to be true, then yes, males liking breasts would be an indication there's statistically enough genetic variation within the population so that females would have breasts. Barring that one specific example, if you assume, which is the standard way, that those genes are unrelated, that the genes that makes the males like breasts and the genes that create breasts are completely unrelated, then at that particular time, you would have males who like breasts and males who do not like breasts. And then you have females who, at that moment, do not have breasts. Then you assume that females have now reached a level at which there is enough genetic variation with the population so that breasts can exist. At that moment, the females are actually not advantaged, even for the males who like breasts, because at that moment that it happens, the breasts are actually very small. You wouldn't even know they're there. But the point is that, again, statistically, now statistically at that point has no real bearing. The only bearing it has is that the genes are there, they're in the population. So at that point, this is where the genes for the phenotypic characteristic starts to expand. So more organisms start to have the genes, more organisms. And it's just very slight breasts. They don't really do anything. They're not really obvious. No one's even noticed. It doesn't even increase their chances of survival. It's just kind of somewhat. And so the first female who would have had those genes might have actually died and never even passed on her genes. We have no idea, okay? Again, statistical likelihood that someone will exhibit breasts is not the same thing as 100% will exhibit breasts. And the first female to have had those genes to create breasts might have not exhibited breasts to begin with, because there might have been something else, another gene that didn't turn it on or didn't function properly with it. And so the first female who could have had that gene might not have had breasts whatsoever, at all. Not even slight, just none at all. And so the point is that the gene now exists within the population. And because the gene exists within the population, there is a statistical chance that it will be exhibited by some of those organisms. Now, we continue. As more and more organisms gain these traits, then some of them will be born with slightly larger breasts. Some of them will be born with slightly smaller breasts. And then this is when evolution starts to take place. Because now there is an actual advantage now? Well, actually, you don't know. Is there an advantage? If there is an advantage to these genes, having larger breasts, then that population will start to increase. They will either mate more or they will have some kind of survival advantage. This is the two main ways that evolution usually happens. Either you have more offsprings or you're likely to survive a catastrophic event. Now, in the case of breasts, since breasts are mostly made of fat, there is a good chance that the reason why women have breasts to begin with is because, so for people who don't know, human women have a larger percentage of fat than males, statistically, and so they're statistically more likely to be fatter. So there's a very good chance that breasts evolve at the same time as the fat storage evolved, and so the women ended up by getting breasts, but the main reason why they had it was for breasts. So there's a very good chance that it's not because males liked breasts, it was a very good chance it's because males liked fatter women. Now, it doesn't really matter in this particular case, and this is just me looking at the options, but the point is that they happen. And so at that point, when they get large enough to actually have an impact on the organism, now if you assume that at first it wasn't sexual preference, you assume that it was a purely survival thing, and so as you go through cycles of starvation, then this is obviously very advantageous. Like the women who have these breasts are more likely to survive. So even without sexual reproduction, they are more likely to survive. They just are more likely to survive, just statistically. And so you see that this is where you see an advantage. The ones who so happen to have the breasts are so happen to survive more. They didn't know. They didn't know this was going to happen. They didn't know they were going to starve. They didn't know they were going to be born with breasts either. They didn't know. And at that point, there was actually no sexual selective bias at that point. You could then also assume that, no, this never happened. There was never any starvation. It was just a male preference. Once the breasts got larger, then the 50% of the males who preferred breasts just started to mate more with the women. Same thing here. Same thing happens. Now, these have more children. The other ones have less children. And so the breasts stay. And at that point, it would be a purely sexually driven characteristic. This would be something like the peacock. The peacock, the large tail, if you've never seen it, very beautiful tail, that is a purely sexual advantage. There are no real survival advantage. It's actually a huge detriment to their health, well-being, and being eaten because they're easy to spot. But you see, clearly they survive. So clearly it's possible to survive even with it. But it's a great example of a purely sexually selective characteristic. Now, if you assume it's a survival characteristic, which I would assume, I actually think that breasts are a survival characteristic rather than a sexual characteristic, because the entire woman has gone fatter. It's not just the breasts. And so the breasts might have just simply been an indication that the woman was fat, because there's also this thing where breasts get bigger in certain animals if they're not giving birth, something like that. Or if they're done giving birth, the breasts get smaller. And you'd have to go check the exact details. Breasts. They're complicated. They're very complicated. Point being, there was an advantage. Seems like there was an advantage to having them to begin with. And so over time, as you go through periods of things like starvation, that would be the biggest example as to why having fat stores would have been advantageous, because if one season you're unlikely to have food, then having fat stores that actually keep you alive for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, just to get you past the winter is a huge advantage. It's a massive advantage. And as you can see, only the women have it, not the males. And so clearly it was an advantage on one side rather than on the other side. Showing you as to why we have dimorphic characteristic. This is exactly it. The gene exists in males too. It's not because it doesn't exist. It's just it's not exhibited. Because from the male perspective, there's no real advantage to this. But that doesn't mean it doesn't affect the rest of our genes. Now again, I'm not an expert. I'm not going to tell you it does or it doesn't. I have no idea. Ask someone else. The point is, it could be exhibited in another way in our genes. A lot of the genes that are in women are also in males. They're just not exhibited the same way or just not exhibited at all. And so you don't see it. So you get these dimorphic characteristics. And the reason why they're there is because women and males evolved to do different jobs. They just evolved to do different jobs. They're complementary jobs. In other words, you need both people to do different things. That's what makes the pairing so advantageous. Because you need both characteristics to have a higher likelihood of survival. And then from that point on, once the breasts have established themselves as a successful characteristic, well then that's when they really start evolving. That's when you get what we generally call, breasts evolved because they're this, because males like them, or because they do this, they lactate and they have fat. See, this is where it starts to make sense. Because now you can actually see the organisms that live or die based on whether or not, or if they reproduce or not based on the fact that they have breasts. Now you can see it. But at the beginning, when you started having breasts, you couldn't know. Even the organism didn't know. The genes didn't know. It's purely random. It's completely random. And so you can't start a conversation about evolution and say that, women have breasts because of, and then you give a function. That makes no sense. The only reason anything ever evolves is because there is a statistical likelihood that the population has a chance of exhibiting the phenotypic characteristic. That is it. That is the only reason anything ever evolves. If anyone ever tells you we have eyes to see, that's wrong. We have eyes by pure random luck. The reason why we still have eyes is because they were useful. It's because it was more useful than not seeing. That is the reason we still have eyes. If it wasn't more advantageous, you'd be dead. For example, this is an example of what I said before, the statistical likelihood of genes being present in the population. The reason why certain animals can't mate together is not because DNA is magical and it doesn't work. No, it's because the DNA that they share statistically, the statistical chance that the DNA that those two animals share together actually creates an organism that works is low. It is unlikely. Now, can you find one specific crab with one specific set of DNA and find a human with another very specific set of DNA, create some kind of weird half human, half crab? It might be possible. If you count the number of crabs, the amount of semen we can produce, and the amount of ovaries women can produce, and same thing for crabs, there is a chance. It is not impossible that you could find two sets of genes that could combine together in some weird way and create an organism that actually lives. Now, what would the organism look like? I have no idea. You having to go through all that stuff just to find two exactly combining sets of genes is just DNA, genes, DNA, whatever. The magic stuff is a huge task. It's a huge undertaking. It is not impossible. It is simply statistically unlikely, and that's what that is. It is a statistical unlikeliness. And as populations diverge, as populations become more and more different, that's what happens. They become statistically less likely to breed. But it is not impossible to find two organisms from completely different species that could potentially, statistically, create at least one surviving organism. And if they could make two, and one of each gender, then, you could maybe start a new species. But this is getting way over the scope of this conversation. So thank you for listening. If at all possible, donate to my Patreon. And goodbye.